So, if it hasn't been clear from some of the other videos on this channel, I love the Trails series. It is one of my favorite video game series of all time, and probably one of my favorite long-form stories ever told. Recently, Trails Through Daybreak II has had its official Western release, marking, for the first time since I've been with the series, and ever, now that I think about it, that we in the West are only one game behind the Japanese releases. And with the Trails in the Sky FC remake being confirmed to be a simultaneous worldwide release, it's looking like the days of us in the West waiting a year or more for these games is coming to an end. This is a monumental achievement for this series, and I want to express my heartfelt appreciation for everyone who has worked on bringing this series to a wider audience, whether that be in an official capacity or just the fans who have spent many years translating these games out of love and passion through fan projects. I really do appreciate everyone who has worked on it. But anyway, back to Daybreak 2. So, this game released recently, and I have been no-lifing it for the past few weeks. And recently, I beat the post-game content. So today, I wanted to do a little bit of a review for the game to explain my thoughts on it. This will be a bit of new ground for me, as not only will this be the first review-type video on my channel, but it will also be the first video that I will go into spoilers for. But do not worry, I will split this video into sections, starting with a spoiler-free section, and I will give a warning as well as time codes before we get into the spoiler section. So with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. I was a bit nervous to play Daybreak 2, as I heard many mixed opinions about it. It's honestly one of Falcom's most divisive games, at least for the Trails series, along with Cold Steel 4 and kinda Sky the Third. Anyway, Daybreak 2 is a very divisive game in the fandom since its original Japanese release. I heard so many not so great things about this game, and given that I think the Calvin arc had a bit of a rocky start for me with Daybreak 1, I was nervous that this might be the first Trails game that I didn't like, or even just that I didn't like as much as the others. But I am happy to say that that was not the case. I, in fact, really like this game, but let's get into specifics. We'll start with the gameplay. If you've seen my Trails ranking video, you'll know that I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the changes that Falcom made to the combat with Daybreak 1, and with Daybreak 2, I still feel the same way for the most part, but there were some pretty significant improvements that I think made me enjoy the combat a lot more than in its direct predecessor. Firstly, the field combat feels a lot smoother. It still has some stiffness, but I don't think it feels nearly as slow as in Daybreak 1. There were also some new things added to the field combat to cut down on some of the repetitiveness, namely quick arts and the change mechanic. Quick arts are an art that you can perform to damage enemies on the field. It's not as useful as a charge attack in terms of damage, but its ability to hit nearby enemies with splash damage makes it great for enemies that are grouped together. Enemy weaknesses also play a role, but from my experience, it wasn't a huge difference in damage. The change mechanic is honestly the cooler addition of the two, in my opinion. It allows for you to swap into another character after perfect dodging. Said character will then swap in and automatically perform their charge attack while also gaining a damage boost for a brief window of time. It helps a lot to cut down on the repetitiveness of some encounters and to speed things up with the damage boost. Beyond that, the field combat is pretty much the same. It's an improvement for sure, but I think Falcom can still do more to make things a bit less repetitive, especially against the more tanky enemies. I think the ability to use a craft or two in the field would be a good addition. Something to further flesh out the character movesets and to cut back on doing the same stuff over and over again. Command battles, on the other hand, don't have too much different from what I remember. There's really only minor differences from Daybreak 1. The turn order is now much more clear than in Daybreak 1, and I like the display a lot more here. There's the addition of the EX chain mechanic as well, which is essentially a dual attack with two party members when the controllable character is boosted and the enemy is stunned. This does some pretty good damage, and it hits nearby enemies as well, which is cool. The transition from field to command battles is also a bit different, with stunned enemies being given a lot less delay. You'll probably only be able to get a single round of turns in before the enemy can act again, unlike in Daybreak 1. EX Chain makes up for this though, as the damage you can do with it will have you clearing out enemies much faster, especially when you get one off right at the start of battle. There are also dual arts, which are arts of two combined elements. These are essentially like Master Arts from Azure or Lost Arts in Cold Steel 2, Cold Steel 4, and Reverie. The only difference is that these can hit the weaknesses of either element. I didn't get a ton of use out of them, except for the Whale one, which had the all-cancel ability, but they are a welcome change, as I felt that the arts were a little disappointing in Daybreak 1, minus Arc and Judgment Feather. Lastly, the biggest change is the ability to only use one S-Craft per boost. Like in Daybreak 1, S-Crafts in Daybreak 2 only cost 100 CP. However, unlike Daybreak 1, in this game, you can't do two of the same character's S-Crafts back to back. The game now prevents a character from using their S-Craft until the boost is exhausted. This, to me, seems like a means of preventing the player from spamming their S-Crafts like in Daybreak 1 and breezing through the game. However, while I do feel like this change is a welcome one, it also just feels unnecessary to me. Just make the S-Crafts cost all your CP again. This is really a it wasn't broke so why fix it kind of thing for me. I do not get why they are keeping with this. It was fine as it was pre-Daybreak. I also feel like it didn't really make things too much harder, as I would just wait for the boost to be up and pop another S-Craft immediately afterwards. So it would, at most, just prolong the battle by maybe like a few turns. I also still think that boosting is tied to way too many things, like the S-Crafts and the Hollow Cores, and I honestly hope they do away with it in future games. I am just not a fan of it. If they want to keep it, I hope that they give you at least one more gauge at the start of battle so you can decide between using two S-Crafts or making full use of your entire party's builds. Regardless, I am still not a fan. In terms of the customization, not much has changed here besides the game adding some more unique quartz, which is a welcome change in my opinion, as that was a big complaint that I had with Daybreak 1. However, I still found myself using a lot of attack 3s and 2s and the like on the same character, so some more variety would still be appreciated going forward. Also, and this part's going to be a little unscripted here because I forgot to add this in, I had an issue with this game in terms of the camera and targeting in command battles. In field battles it was fine, but when trying to target some enemies in command battles, I just feel like it was really awkward and it wouldn't target the enemy that I wanted. I honestly don't know what happened here because I don't remember this being a huge problem that I had in Daybreak 1. I remember it happening a few times, and I remember not having this problem at all in any of the earlier 3D Trails games. So again, I don't know what happened. I think it's just Daybreak's thing of because the movement is free roam now instead of costing a turn, it's based around the point of focus being the targeted enemy rather than just being the center of the arena or whatever. So I think that might be the cause of it, but yeah, it's just a little weird, and I think the kind of positioning of the camera does make it harder to view area of effect, especially for buff arts and stuff. So honestly, I feel like if they just raise the camera up a little bit, give you a little bit more of a bird's eye view for command battles, I think I would like that a little bit more, but again, not a huge issue, just something I noticed. Now we can talk about the story, and this part is spoiler free, so don't worry about that. The story of Daybreak 2 is honestly pretty good. I have some issues with it, but it worked for what it was, which is more of a character-focused story. It felt more like an epilogue for Daybreak 1 than a full-blown sequel in that sense, which makes sense for how this game was developed, from my understanding. The characters are really what steal the show here. I think they were much better done in this game than in Daybreak 1. My love for the ASO is much higher now. I absolutely adore them as a cast. While I do think that Agnes, Van, and Judith didn't get too much in this game for me, everyone else had some amazing moments, which I felt was needed, especially for Aaron and Ferry. This game brought me to tears at honestly a lot of points, which is something I really value in a game. In terms of antagonists though, I wasn't a huge fan. The Garden Master was fine, and I liked the lore that came with him, but none of them really interested me. That is, except for Harwood. Harwood is great in this game. He's probably the best Falcom has done with the whole evil for the sake of being evil type of villain since Weissman, and I think it's due to his personality. He's not laughing maniacally or sitting on a throne of bones or whatever, which I think can be fine in some cases. He's just laid back and nonchalant about everything, and it makes him so much more entertaining in my opinion. His unpredictability also makes it so that he commands pretty much every scene he's in. That, in conjunction with him being probably the scariest Anguis, even if he isn't the strongest, makes for such an interesting character in my opinion. He's great. Also, his S-Craft is raw as hell. Lastly, I want to talk about the pacing. This game probably has the worst pacing in the series in my opinion, and I think that is due to two things. The first is the Marion Garden. This is pretty much Daybreak II's version of the True Reverie Corridor from Reverie, and it kind of sucks. It's boring, and the rewards you get from it are kind of buns, to be honest. Even the way you go about doing the gacha stuff is more boring than it was in Reverie. Better get ready to put this game in turbo mode and hold down the X button for 5 straight minutes. Plus, the absence of anything the TRC had, like the hub area to talk to characters, or the daydreams, or the minigames, just make it a downgrade in my opinion. Anytime Mirabelle showed up to tell me there was a new floor, I groaned a bit. And the post-game having nearly as many floors as the rest of the game is just awful. A huge downgrade from the True Reverie Corridor in pretty much every conceivable way. It truly felt like padding to me. The other aspect I think messed with the pacing are the lengths of the acts. Acts 1 and 2 were split in half, which made them feel much shorter. Fragments in Act 3, on the other hand, felt like they dragged a little bit, especially Act 3. And I love Fragments, don't get me wrong, but it did feel mad long to me. Speaking of the dreaded Act 3, I don't really mind it. This was the part of the game that I heard horror stories about before playing it. People put it on par with both Cold Steel 2 and Cold Steel 4's Act 2, which I have mentioned that I actually really like those acts, but I digress. I was expecting Act 3 to reach out on my TV and give me a swirly or something. But yeah, it wasn't that bad, honestly. I have a few problems with some story decisions, which I will get to in the spoiler section, but yeah, besides that and the length, I quite liked it for the character moments. I can see the problems, but I think it's way overhated. I also want to briefly mention the soundtrack of this game. Daybreak 2 probably has my least favorite soundtrack in the series. I don't think it's bad by any stretch of the imagination, and I quite like a lot of the songs in this game, but I feel like it doesn't have as many hits for me as the other games. This is especially seen in the final boss themes, which I think are where Sound Team JDK does their best work. Where to Join the Chorus has really grown on me as time has gone on, but the others are just kinda meh. Nothing is on the level of the like of Great Power, Unmitigated Evil, The Merciless Savior, The Azure Arbitrator, or The Perfect Steel of Zero, which is a shame. Also, and this might be a hot take, but I am really not a big fan of when the opening song plays as a final boss theme. Daybreak 1 did this too, and I just don't like it. I like the songs, don't get me wrong, and I know this is a very anime thing, which I like it when an anime does it, but for a video game, I just don't know. I much prefer video games to have unique final boss music, especially in longer JRPGs. Using the opening as a motif for a unique song like in Great Power or Arrival Existence is perfectly fine for me, but getting to the final fight and just hearing the opening again is kind of disappointing in my opinion. Now we'll move on to the spoiler section, and I will be mentioning spoilers for the entire series up to this point. Please skip to the timecode on screen for my final thoughts if you don't want to hear those spoilers. If you do, please keep in mind that I have not played Kai no Kiseki, so please do not spoil anything for that game in the comments down below. I will remove your comment if you do. So here's your chance to click away or skip to my final thoughts. Okay, I think that should be enough time. With that, let's get into the spoilers. The story of this game is kind of all over the place in a different way than Daybreak 1 was, but I still don't think it's bad. What I mean is that there is an underlying plot to find the 8th Genesis, with Van finding the pieces of its outer casing outside of Edith, and Agnes, Swin, and Nadia investigating the weird happenings in the capital. However, a lot of the minute-to-minute moments of this game feel a bit disjointed to me. Daybreak 1 also felt kind of disjointed, with Almada being the connecting factor, but for the most part, the actual reasoning for Almada being where they were and doing what they didn't feel like it played too much into what the story eventually leads to, which is why I say that it felt a bit disjointed, and we'll return to this point later, but the chapters themselves felt cohesive. Quick side note, looking back at Daybreak 1, I kind of wish Falcom modeled the chapters a bit more after the first half of Sky SC, with each Armada member getting their own chapter. Melchior could be Chapter 1, Alexander with Chapter 2, Viola Chapter 3, Olympia with 4, Ariok with the intermission, and I guess Dante's with 5. I feel like this could have better served to flesh out the members as characters and set them up as foils with the ASO, but I digress. Daybreak 2, on the other hand, has some moments that just don't really feel like the logical next step to me, especially in some of the Edith sections. Like, going from that one dude from the Ren Daydream and Reverie blowing up the Aramis Science Lab to the terrorists from Azure taking over the school just didn't feel all that cohesive to me. It felt more like shock factor, but I wouldn't say that I flat out disliked it either. It was alright. One of my biggest gripes with this game, however, is in the world building. I feel like Calvard hasn't really gotten as big of a focus as the other regions did by this point in their arcs. I think that is in part due to the fact that we barely get to explore outside of the cities. With how things are right now, Calvard seems more like a series of disjointed areas than a connected nation, in my opinion. I really hope Kai rectifies this, because for as much as I love towns and cities, the different connecting roads, highways, ruins, and natural regions like parks and lakes are what makes these locations feel more like nations to me. I love how, despite not being able to walk around the entirety of Erebonia, for example, like you could in Crossbell or Liberl, you could still map out the entirety of the nation from the different highways and roads that you could walk along. Calvard doesn't have this, which I think is a shame. We also don't know much about Calvard as a nation in terms of its government or its military. Sure, we know that there's an army, navy, and air force, and we know that it's a republic with a president and 2 main political parties, but we don't know anything about its legislature or how long the presidential terms are, or the different divisions that form the military, or anything like that. This might sound like a weird complaint if you don't know much about Trail's world building, but this series typically really goes into this stuff. To put it into perspective, Calvard is apparently split into 4 or 5 different regions. The only reason we know this is because of the map. No one in-game ever mentions these regions, and we don't even really know which cities are in which regions, or who runs the local governments of these regions, or cities for that matter. By this point in the other arcs, we knew the regions, their local governments, and said local governments' relationships with the national government. This is the kind of stuff that I really like in Trails, so its absence here honestly really gets to me. Also, only slightly related, but what's going on with Heiyue? Every game since their introduction has made them worse and worse, in my opinion. Daybreak 2 is the worst that they have been. I was so hyped to learn about them going into this arc, but now my interest is almost gone. Instead of learning about the different families and their values and how they influence different parts of the underworld, we get one of the worst Trails characters ever introduced with Gao Long. And we get to see Sal just kinda start his own family. The Sal family thing I had an issue with, but after it was explained in fragments that he was just trying to reestablish his old family for his personal gain, I was fine with it. But this all just worked to make Heiyue look like a joke to me. Like, this is legit the largest criminal organization, and the best they got is Sao and Gaolong. Gaolong, the guy whose whole thing is just being arrogant and being strong, and then turns out he's one of the easiest recurring bosses in the series. This dude was weaker than the literal child who legit did not want to be there for that fight, mind you. I have more problems with Heiyue, but I don't want to rant more than I already have. This game and Daybreak 1 have just made me completely lose interest in them as an organization. As you can probably tell from this whole section, I wasn't a big fan of Act 2A. One final thing before we get into the real meat of this spoiler section that I want to mention is Fragments. I absolutely loved this chapter. Even if the last 5 minutes were kinda meh, the rest is pure peak fiction. There were so many great character moments, especially the Ren stuff, with Cross coming back and her finally coming to terms with her past. And even though I did see it coming that Nemeth Island was the location of Paradise, I wasn't spoiled, I just kind of got it through context clues. I still felt a pit form in my stomach, and that just goes to show how well written that whole setup was in Sky the Third. Also, the Catra stuff and the entire ASO being like, hey, we love you no matter what, when they found out about his own past with the cult and the fact that he's intersex is amazing. And also, just a quick side note, I really love the fact that Falcom made Catra intersex. For one, because I think it's important to have representation for people in fiction, including people with different gender identities. And two, because I think it just adds a lot to his character. I love his whole connection event in the finale where he mentions that he presented as male throughout his whole life, and then he made that VTuber avatar, which, by the way, yeah, VTubers exist in the Trails universe, which I think is kind of funny. But he made that VTuber avatar to show what he would have looked like had he presented as female for his entire life up to that point, because he wanted to see what it felt like. And I honestly think that's really cool. And also, the connection events in this game are just phenomenal. I think that these events are in contention for the best they have done in the series. At least it's battling it out with Cold Steel 4, in my opinion. Anyway, Fragments is just chef's kiss. It legit brought me to tears at multiple points, especially the Ren and Catra moments. The character work in this game is phenomenal at certain points. Also, Harwood is amazing in this chapter. His attitude throughout this whole section is entertaining as hell, and it really cemented how evil and how scary he can be, especially with the whole biological and chemical weapon stuff. Not to mention how he was somehow aware of the rewinds, and how he has that one cool as hell line at one of the dead ends where he goes something along the lines of, guess you'll just have to do better next time. It's great. He's amazing. But now let's talk about the really controversial stuff. That being the rewind mechanic and the corrosion. Starting with the former, I didn't mind the rewind stuff, honestly. I thought it was a neat thing, and if my assumption is correct that the Septarian of Time is the focus for this arc, then I think it could play into a lot of really interesting things down the line. The dead ends themselves were pretty hit or miss for me, though. Some of them were kind of goofy, to be honest, and I wasn't a big fan of how sometimes it felt like the characters were being a little out of character and stupid with certain things, like how Van would be like, something feels very wrong, but I'm not going to mention it. But nothing ever really took me out of the story. I think as an overall concept, it's cool, it just wasn't executed as well as it could have been. My biggest problem with it is honestly in its linearity. Now, I know complaining about linearity in a Trails game is like complaining about cowboys in Red Dead Redemption 2, but I feel like Daybreak 2 could have benefited from the player having the ability to avoid dead ends by paying attention to clues and doing the correct things without having to necessarily see the dead ends to progress. I think Fragments is the only section that has this, from what I remember, and even then, it's just talking to people in a different order, or maybe fighting a boss before you should. I think the ability to avoid the dead ends preemptively by finding your own clues would have been cool, even if I do realize that a lot of dead ends are there for the characters to see and learn things important for the story. I just think that it could have been done a little bit better. I also think that there are some contrivances with how the time travel works, like characters conveniently remembering their development, or the Genesis coming with you, but the latter can be explained by the Genesis just being special. In that sense, I also have a complaint about how the Genesis just seem to be able to do whatever is needed for the plot to move forward. I felt like this in Daybreak 1 as well, but it feels a lot worse here, in my opinion. Still, nothing game-breaking for me. But let's talk about the corrosion, and yeah, I can kind of see why people don't like this. It's similar to the curse from Cold Steel 4, but in a way, I think it's a little bit worse in my opinion. Now, I actually like the curse concept. It plays into the weakness of humanity thing that I think all Septarians play into, and it only works by eating at the weaknesses inside of someone. In that way, it helps to explore some character flaws while also allowing them to keep their agency. The corrosion, on the other hand, does seem a bit more heavy-handed. It works by making someone see a different possible outcome that rewrites their memory. This is initially presented as the corrosion affecting the person's weaknesses, but that's thrown out pretty quickly in my opinion. Honestly, it kind of just does whatever is needed to put characters against the main cast. Some are fine, like Ferry and Rosette, as the rewrites legit had to wipe the past game from their memory, and it allowed for some great character moments as a result. Ferry's, especially with her struggling with her worth and direction in life, was fantastic, and I think was really needed for her character. But the others just feel kind of meh. Like, Ashin and Holly's had me going, damn, that's all it took for you to literally murder the ASO? And it actively soured me on their characters a bit. All in all, though, I wouldn't say it's bad, just not great. It led to some great character moments, like the Ferry and Rosette ones, and even one with Gramhart, which was cool. The worst, however, was Swin. Swin's whole deal in Act 3 was a bit of a mess in my opinion. I think it just wasn't explained well, but from what I gathered, he thought the Garden Master was Ace, and in that moment of weakness, he was manipulated to accept the corrosion willingly, which then influenced his actions. At least that's the interpretation that I choose to go with, because I really don't like the idea that for any reason he would pick the Garden Master, whether he thought he was Ace or not, over Nadia and completely reel back his character growth. I wouldn't even have a problem with the latter interpretation if they showed him struggling with his remorse or feeling like he wouldn't be able to properly face Nadia while her brother was walking around. But they didn't really go into any of that. He wasn't even present for most of the act. Frankly, I would have just preferred that it was all an act to get the Garden Master to lower his guard, as a callback to 3 and 9 with Swin and Nadia's roles being reversed. But what can you do? It wasn't game ruining, but I certainly wasn't a fan. It did, however, lead to some great character moments with Swin, Nadia, and Ace, and then also Swin, Nadia, and Lapis, both of which were great, but that moment with Ace was just perfection. It almost brought me to tears. So all in all, while I do have a lot of problems with the corrosion, I don't think it's nearly as bad as people say. I do prefer the curse as a concept, but if we learn more about the corrosion and its possible connections to a Septarian, I can see myself enjoying it more. But as of right now, it's just kind of in this weird state of me thinking that it was okay, but it could have been done better. Moving on, however, I did like that the Garden Master was Auguste. I thought it was a cool twist, and one that I did manage to call, but I do think that it wasn't handled as well as it could have been, especially with us not really knowing what Auguste's ideals were. We just know that he had different ideas from Sheena and crew, and that he wanted to rewrite history to bring them to fruition, but we never really got to hear what those ideals were. At least not in this game. They might have mentioned it briefly in Daybreak 1. It's just another case of the Calvard arc not going deep enough with the world building for my liking up to this point. I would have liked to learn more about the Calvardian Revolution, but what can you do? Now, Dingo being the Grendel Zolga was also something that I did call, but not until like right before the final dungeon. I initially thought it was Professor Epstein, but then the game legitimately called me out on this, with Van saying the same thing and then saying that it was too ridiculous of an idea, and Nina being like, yeah, that is pretty crazy, and I was like, alright game, fuck you too, I guess. Anyway, I wasn't sure how to feel about the Dingo reveal at first, but I think it paid off in the end with a really great moment with Van and Marielle. Also, Rufus showed up, kinda, which was awesome. I'm also not sure about all the karma stuff or how all the altered timelines were going to be restored, but I'm hoping Kai will have more answers for that. Side note, I'm not a big fan of how the final boss fight was ordered. I think the Grendel Zolga Sin form should have been the final one. I know Falcom wanted to have the whole Grendel off moment at the end, but it just didn't make sense to me that he would willingly power down to fight with a weaker form after starting off with his strongest. Plus, the Grendel off could have still happened, just have it be in a cutscene after the Grendel Zolga goes for one last attempted victory after being defeated in his most powerful form. Also, the whole gimmick of the first form breaking the shards and forcing you into action combat was cool as hell, and it took me completely off guard. The time turning back mechanic was also pretty neat, but I'm not as big a fan of it as I think a lot of other people are, mainly because I feel like I killed those forms way too fast for it to really sink in. But the Grendel Zolga form is just cool as hell, in my opinion. Some last minute things. I kind of assumed so from the Kai opening, but it looks like they're doing something with Hamilton. I hope it doesn't turn out that she's evil, as I really like her so far. I think an ends justify the means direction would be cooler for her, personally. Ix and Yorda becoming a kind of like dual Enforcer number 20 is cool, but what the hell does Harwood mean when he says there's 2 slots for Enforcers left? Unless I'm wrong, I think there's only 1 major Arcana left, so what the heck is the other one supposed to be? There's some serious build-up with Grahamheart as well, so I'm really excited to see where that goes. I also still don't know what's going on with Nina, or the Pope for that matter. I know she said she was the Eschaton Saint, which is a dope as hell name, by the way, and that the captain of Iscariot doesn't actually exist, but wouldn't she still functionally be the captain if she's giving orders to Iscariot? But I digress. Regardless, I'm excited to see and learn more about what's going on with her, even if I was spoiled on her reveal before I even played this game. To wrap up my final thoughts, Trails Through Daybreak 2 is a great game. It stumbles for me with some parts of its story, but I think it has some great character moments that more than make up for it. Despite some strange changes, the combat is an overall improvement from the previous installment in my opinion. But I do think it still needs more time to improve to even touch the levels that the series used to be at in terms of combat. The pacing was a little rough in some places, but I think the game still more than managed to keep my interest. The Märchengarten is buns. Lastly, I am really excited for what the arc will bring with Kai and its following conclusion, whatever that game will be called. And most importantly, Trails is still peak. Now, I don't like giving games numbered scores, and since I consider every game in this series to be a 10 out of 10, I would also give that to Daybreak 2, which probably doesn't mean much. So I'll just say that Daybreak 2 is another great Trails game that retains the same quality in both its story and gameplay as the rest of the series. I know this game has a lot of criticism, much of it valid, but if you're watching this and you're worried about it, I would say don't be. I love this game, and it's currently my game of the year. In terms of ranking, I would place this game just above Daybreak 1 and below Azure for me. So between the lower end and middle of my ranking of the series. Still, as I mentioned in my Trails ranking video, I would consider every game in this series to be among my favorite games of all time, and Trails to Daybreak 2 is no different. Man, what a series. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Trails Through Daybreak 2. I hope this video was to your liking. I know it was a little bit of a new ground for me in terms of content, as I don't typically do reviews on this channel. I'm not sure if this is going to continue to be a thing. I'll probably do something similar for every Trails game that comes out at least, but I'm not sure for other games and whatnot. If I do, it'll probably be more older games rather than newer ones that have come out. But yeah, let me know what you think. I know I can probably improve upon this formula, as I was probably a little bit rambly, especially in the spoiler section. And I could probably make the video a little bit more cohesive and all that. So yeah, please let me know what you think. If you like the video, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. All that really does help me out. Also subscribe to the gaming podcast that I do with my friend called the Deserted Gamer Podcast. It is a lot of fun. We enjoy making podcasts over there. We release an episode once a month, and it's just a fun time. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful week, and if you plan on playing Trails to Daybreak 2, I hope you enjoy your time with it. With all that said, peace.